Hi, I'm John Nunn, and in this video I'm going to talk about a new book from Gambit Publications, Practical Chess Openings, which will probably be known by its initials PCO. It's a one-volume opening encyclopedia, a traditional chess genre. Those who are as old as I am will remember in our youth taking copies of modern chess openings to junior tournaments. And since then there have been a number of one-volume encyclopedias. Indeed, several years ago we published one ourselves, Fundamental Chess Openings. So the question is, what is different about this book? What does it have to offer? And I hope to show you something of the contents of the book by looking at one particular variation. But first of all, I'll mention that the author, Martin Kravtsev, is a Ukrainian Grandmaster who's also an experienced chess trainer. And I think he's done a really good job with this book. If you're going to cover all chess openings in one book, even a massive one like this, 544 pages, then you're going to have to be selective about the material you present, which openings you're going to focus on, how much detail you're going to go into, and so on. He has focused largely on opening lines which are currently popular. So you won't find that much about very old-fashioned openings which have fallen into disuse, but you will find quite a lot about lines which have been developed in the last few decades and which are currently popular at high level and at club level. In terms of detail, it's a step up from our other book, Fundamental Chess Openings. That really focused very heavily on general ideas. This book has a mixture of both. It gives you the general ideas in each opening, but where there's something concrete that would be difficult to work out over the board, the author goes into that as well, which I think is quite a useful balance. So the opening line I want to look at is a line in the Italian game. Well, of course, a lot of people still play the Rilo Pes or Spanish, putting the bishop on b5. But there have been quite a few new ideas for black in Spanish, not only, of course, the solid Berlin Wall, which has already put some people off playing the white side, but there are also some other lines which have improved black's defences in some critical positions. So in the last couple of decades, a lot of people, even the very top players, have switched to playing bishop c4. And they don't play it in the old way, which was to play here d4. They instead play this quiet system. Used to be called the Griego Pianissimo, but people generally call it just Italian game these days. You can also play it when black plays the two knights, 3 knight f6 is just a change in move order. Although, of course, if black plays knight f6, he also has the option of the system with bishop e7. But I won't go into that. We're going to look at the position that arises here. It's one that's occurred very often, and black frequently, and say 40 years ago, almost always played a6 here. I myself had a couple of games with Korchnoi in that line. The bishop is going to drop back to a7. White will expand on the queen side, b4 and a4. Black will counter, often by some kind of manoeuvres on the king side, maybe knight e7 to g6 or castles, and knight h5 to f4, if that ever becomes possible. So you've got a kind of queen side versus king side play. But with a5, black adopts a different strategy. He simply prevents immediately white's queenside expansion. And at first you might say, well, okay, that's great. Well, why didn't everybody play this? Well, of course, like most chess moves, it has a downside. The first downside is that white doesn't have to worry that this bishop on c4 is going to be exchanged by knight a5. So white can often get away with not playing bishop b3, which saves the tempo. Also, the square b5 is slightly weakened. It might be occupied by the bishop or possibly even by the knight. But a word of warning to white players here. Even if black plays his bishop back to a7 and knight a3 to b5 appears more tempting, you should bear in mind that after black just puts his bishop back on b6, your knight on b5 might not be doing very much. It's not really attacking anything particularly significant. Well, the author gives a general description of plans for both sides, which is fine. And then we look at the concrete lines. We start, the main line is rook e1. Black actually has a range of options here. He can play h6 if he's worried about bishop g5, or he can drop the bishop back to a7 straight away. But the main line, I should say that these alternatives are covered in the book, but the main line is that black castles. And now there are two main possibilities. White can either play bishop g5 or he can play h3. Well, bishop g5 leads to quite a complicated game. It's the sharper of the two alternatives. The pin is obviously a little bit awkward. The bishop can't go back to e7 to unpin the knight. So the only real way to unpin the knight is for black to play h6 and g5. So he does so. Well, you always have to ask yourself, can white sacrifice on g5 in positions like this? And in fact, it's not very effective in this position. But unless you have an absolutely identical position, you always have to check whether or not it works. One of the things I always try to say when I'm explaining things to club players is look at the position. You know, they tend to learn a system, they know you put this piece there and that piece on some other square, and then they just play the same moves more or less, ignoring what their opponent's doing. But you always have to look. Even a slight change can make a big difference. For example, if white had played king h1 instead of rook f1, of rook e1, then the sacrifice on g5 would be a lot stronger. Because after these moves, white would then have the possibility of f4. But as it is, black has at least two reasonable options. He can play king g7, or he can play bishop g4. Queen d2, and then king g7. Well, when I saw this position, I thought, yes, that's possible. White doesn't have very many attacking pieces on the king side. And then I wondered if white could play here d4. E takes d4, queen f4. And I thought, this looks a little bit dangerous because, you're threatening immediately bishop takes f6 and queen takes g4. So, well, black should probably play knight e5. And then I thought, okay, check, king h8, bishop takes f8. Now this looks a bit awkward. White's threatening mate in 2, and he also can answer queen takes bishop with queen takes knight check. And it's where you have a thought like that it's useful to turn the engine on, and you immediately find that black has the not particularly obvious move knight g8, giving him an advantage. Now that's of course one of the good points about having the book on the app, is that you can turn the engine on anytime. Well, again, that's also showing that the knight h5 is good as well. But it provides a lot of reassurance to know that the machine is backing up a particular opinion. So I then came to agree with the author's verdict that the sacrifice on g5 doesn't work. So in fact, after the g5, the bishop has to go back to g3. It's not a disaster for white to have the bishop on g3. If he can play d4 later, he'll be pressing against the e5 pawn. But of course, the bishop can easily become passively placed on g3. Well, here's another example of the way the author handles things. g4 looks like a kind of natural move, because if the knight has to move, it's very hard for white to force through d4. But as he points out, white can sacrifice a piece, like this. Well, yeah, this is a bit better for white than the previous sacrifice, even though black has a pawn more, because he's gained the tempo, his queen's already on f3, and also black doesn't have the move rook h8 hitting the bishop. Well, as it happens, white has an immediate draw here. He can play queen g3 check, king moves queen f3, king has to go back, and it's a draw by repetition. He can also play a move like knight d2, as the author proposes, because he always has this draw in hand. Well, it may be that objectively speaking, that this sacrifice gives white no more than a draw. Nevertheless, I'm not entirely sure I'd like to defend this with black. So what he's saying is he gives these general ideas for both sides, but where there's some concrete tactical thing which would be difficult to see over the board, he also gives that. And that's a useful way of explaining opening lines. So white now goes knight a3. The knight's not necessarily going to b5, it can also go to c2 and e3, where it can take aim at the square g5, which has been slightly weakened by black's kingside pawn advances. Well, okay, if we go through a few more moves, we can see the type of position that arises. And this is a kind of typical structure or setup you get in this variation. At first it looks as though white's doing quite well, because after knight e3 the knight's already aiming for f5, but after knight e7 actually it's more difficult for white to find a constructive plan. Position is double-edged, and the author discusses various plans for white. It suggests white can just wait with playing maybe rook c1, or he could take advantage of the fact that the b5 square is undefended to put the bishop there. Black has various options for playing on the king side, even playing rook g8, king moves, and finally g4. So computer, as he says, evaluates the position of equal, that's right. It's very complex, and in practice with human players it would offer chances for both sides. Well, the second line is with h3 on move 8 instead of bishop g5. That's in this position white plays h3 and not bishop g5. Black tends to play h6, so neither side can now develop their queen's bishop to the most active square. And after a few more moves, natural moves by both sides, knight b d2, as you can see there are various alternatives analysed here. Bishop e6 is actually quite bad for white to exchange on e6 in positions like this. If he does so, the f file is opened and black has natural attacking possibilities like knight h5 to f4, queen e8 to g6. And whereas in the lines with a6, white has some natural queenside play with b4, a4, b5, and sometimes he plays rook a2 to defend the f2 square. White has a kind of natural counterplay. Here he doesn't have such natural counterplay, and it's much more difficult to counter black's kingside activity. So it's not a good idea to swap on e6. Instead, bishop b5 is a good move. He wants to take on c6 and play d4, playing on the centre rather than the queen side. Well, black has a move that's not particularly obvious. He plays queen b8. And the idea here is with the queen on a7, not only is he restraining d4, but he's also forcing white to do something about his f2 pawn. Well, let's just see how the line plays out. There's now a very complicated tactical line actually. If white plays here d4, which I won't go into, the author analyses that. But the safest option is of course bishop e3. Black swaps and starts this knight manoeuvre, incidentally preventing white from doubling his pawns. Knight's going to g6, leaving the bishop looking kind of a bit out on a limb. So again, it's another chances for both sides position. One of the reasons I think why this line with a5 has become rather popular is that black isn't just playing defensively. In most lines, he has some active possibilities himself, which is generally speaking a more attractive proposition. So to summarise, it's a very, very large one-volume opening encyclopedia. It's at a somewhat higher level to our other book, Fundamental Chess Openings. It covers both general plans and concrete variations, where concrete variations are essential. And of course, it's completely up to date, with some interesting computer suggestions from time to time. So I think a very worthwhile book. And if you don't fancy carrying a 544-page book to your tournament, then there's the Kindle and app versions also available. I'm in fact using Gambit's app, Chess Studio, to play over the moves and show you these variations. Well, thank you for watching this video, and I hope to see you for the next one.